Hey, all right. That was once again Mr. Fair playing us in with little Hamilton. All right. So the last time that we were together, we talked about Mr. Fair actually covered. Um, he talked about the philosophers Locke and Hobbes, and basically how John Locke was more kind of an optimist when it came to his views on humanity and people, and how Hobbes was kind of the opposite, how that really shaped their views of government. And then I gave you a really quick glimpse of British history. Talked about the Magna Carta, we talked about the Barons' War, and we talked about the Glorious Revolution. From there, we then jumped into the Constitutional Convention, and I said, there's three issues. Um, there's three issues that revolve around um, the Constitutional Convention. Um, and we only got to the first conflict. No, that's me. Sorry, my TV was on. So we only got to the first conflict, and the first conflict was about tariffs. And so this is where we're going to take off from here. All right, go ahead. Why didn't the Anti-Federalists want the federal government to control trade? Go ahead, and Mr. Ferris just threw a pear deck in there for you. Um, what's that? All right. So once you get that answered, hey, feel free to go to attendance because I only got like 5 people that are signed in right now. So go ahead and take a look at attendance. Oh, all right. Here are some answers. Let's see. Tariffs are placed on goods coming. Okay, so we got 7 people. All right. Out of, well, it's pretty good. 8 people, 9 people, 10. All right. So we got about a quarter of you guys right now. That means 1 out of 4 for those of you who skipped math class today. All right, well, I'm going to top off at 12 there, Mr. Fair. 12 out of 42. All right. Well, there's the pear deck again, Mr. Fair. I'll throw that up there. And, hey, we're getting better with attendance, though. We still got probably about 15 people that are going to get marked absent. So make sure you get the attendance done. Make sure that you put something in the pear deck. So here's the thing. If you answered the pear deck, if you did anything, if you put any answer in whatsoever, guess what? You're right. Because the answer to that pear deck, why did the Anti-Federalists not want the federal government to control trade? Well, because if there are tariffs placed on goods coming from Europe, the southern goods might be taxed going to Europe. So they didn't want that reciprocal trade. If the federal government controlled trade, then really the North would control it because the North had a larger population. We'll come back to that in 1 second. And third, the Anti-Federalists believed that tariffs were a matter for the state. That just makes sense because an Anti-Federalist wants a stronger state government and a weaker federal government. All right, so give me 1 second here. All right, so that is kind of what we covered last time. We talked about conflict 1 having to do with the tariffs. Okay, the South, the Anti-Federalists, felt that tariffs are a matter for the state, and the North, the Federalists, felt that they wanted the federal government to control that. I am. All right, So here's the thing, though. I said the North had a larger population, and they would actually control trade. That is, unless the South could somehow find a way to increase their population. How could the South increase their population? So here's the thing: that whole tariff issue, we got to put that in the back burner because we can't even try to work on that tariff issue until we try to work on something else. Conflict number two, and conflict number two is representation. Representation. So we're talking about here. This is an issue between the small states and the big states when we look at representation. Now, here there are two distinct plans. This is a little bit more straightforward than the whole taxation issue. There are two distinct plans here, and we're talking about the representation in Congress. We're talking about the representation at the federal level. We're talking about the representation in the lawmaking branch of the government. Well, at least what we know as the lawmaking branch today. So there's two plans put out there. One was called the New Jersey plan. Now the small states like New Jersey really like this plan. And the reason they really like this plan was because it gave them as much power as any of the bigger states. You see, the Jersey plan said there's going to be one House of Congress and every state gets the same number of votes. It's kind of like the old Articles of Confederation. One state, one vote. And New Jersey looks at states like, Pennsylvania and Virginia and New York, and they're saying, holy cow, look how many more people they have in these states. I mean, if we have proportional representation, that is population, or the representation based on population, we don't have any power. And really, guess what? That's what this whole thing boils down to, is power. Power. Who's going to have more power? And states like New Jersey, the small states, Rhode Island, they're going to say, hey, you know what? We really need to have as much power as any of those other states, or why are we going to join this union? Why are we going to get into this country if we don't have a say? So that's what these smaller states want. They want the New Jersey plan. The larger states, however, they say, well, it only makes sense. I mean, we have a larger population. Shouldn't we have more power? I mean, if we had one vote per state, we're kind of underrepresenting our own population here. So what the Virginias of the world wanted, they wanted the Virginia plan. And that meant there's going to be a two-house Congress. And that both houses are going to be based on proportional representation, or representation based on population. So, the Virginia plan. Okay, so first, the New Jersey plan. One House of Congress, equal representation. Everybody's the same. The Virginia plan. Two houses of Congress, or bicameral legislature. That's your little Latin for today. Bicameral legislature, or two houses of Congress, and both those houses would be based on proportional representation. All right. Well, here's the problem. If you look at the population of these states, not only is this a big state, small state type of thing, but remember, it says based on population. Now, if you look at a state like, I don't know, Virginia. Virginia looks like it's a big state in population, but take a look at this. Take a look at this diagram and tell me what you see about, I don't know, Virginia's population or Georgia's population. Go ahead, and are we going to put this in the Pear Deck, Mr. Fair, or do you want to put this in the chat? What do you want to do? All right. Yeah, so you can put this, you can put it in the Pear Deck, put your name with it, or you can put it in the chat and just pop her in there. What do you notice about this, this graphic that I'm showing you right now? Now, just so you know, and I'll kind of explain it as you guys are thinking about this, the colored parts of this represent the non-slave population. The blackened out part, the top part there, that represents the slave population. Okay, so you see on the bottom, you see the colored parts. That's the non-slave population. The top part that is blackened out, that's the slave population. So what do you notice about that? All right. Yeah, you guys are all kind of right there. Now, my question was not that good. I'm going to be honest with you. My question was, what do you notice about, I think, Virginia as opposed to those other states? Really, what I really wanted to ask you guys was, what do you notice about those states? And you guys hit the nail on the head. Um, there's a lot more slaves in the South, says Gwen. About half, I saw somebody say about half of some of the populations were slaves, like Georgia, and well, Georgia, like yeah, 50%, like 1 in 2 people that are living there are slaves. You look at Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina, you get about a quarter of the people that are living there are slaves, and in Virginia, about a third. So yeah, a huge part of the population of those southern states were slaves. So okay, so what does this mean? If we go back to what I was saying before about the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, so I said this is a matter of small state versus big state. Well, some of these states that you might think are big, and population-wise, they might actually be small, unless guess what? You count the slaves, and that can make a dramatic difference in the population swing. So I showed you that graphic. Let's look at some real numbers here. If we look at the north, and this is kind of what we consider the northern states, there's about 2.4 million people living in the north at this time, and about 1.6 living in the south. If we look at the north slave population, there's about 2.3 million non-slave, about 2.3 million non-slave people in the north. In the south, the population of non-slave is right around 1 million. Now, juxtapose that to the number of slaves. So we got under 100,000 slaves in the north, and in the south you have 604,000. So yeah, you have like about, you have a lot more slaves in the south. So if somehow the South could count the slaves as population, they'd have a lot more. Here it comes again. Ready? They have a lot more power at the federal level. So that's what they're going to be pushing for. They're going to push for those slaves to be part of their population. So the South would favor the Virginia plan, but they would only favor the Virginia plan if the slaves are counted as population. Mr. Fair, are we going to show this video or not? I can't remember. No? Okay. So here we go. Let's kind of recap here. We got that whole tariff issue I explained before, right? We couldn't figure out the tariff issue until we figured out representation. And I just laid out the representation issue. Is it the New Jersey plan or the Virginia plan? Well, we can't figure that out until guess what? Until we figure out what and how are we going to count the slaves. And here is where it gets even more difficult because the North want to like institute this it's kind of a property tax. And they want to count those slaves as property, which means that the slave owners would have to pay a tax on every slave they own. Guess what? The slave owners don't want to do that. The slave owners, they're weird like that. They don't want to pay more taxes. So they say, no, we're not going to count those slaves as property and have to pay taxes on them. Matter of fact, the South turns around and says, matter of fact, those slaves, those people that we're keeping against their will and that we have enslaved, they're not really slaves. They're population. And actually, they count towards the representation we should have at the federal level. So isn't that weird? I mean, think about this for a second. The South, on one hand, they're saying they're slaves because they have them as slaves. They've kept them enslaved, right? But on the other hand, they're saying, oh, well, they're people and they should be counted for the purposes of population. The North, on the other hand, on one hand, they're saying, hey, you know what? Those slaves are people. And on the other hand, they're saying, hey, guess what? Those slaves, they need to be counted as property for taxation purposes. It's not a real logical argument by either side. So we have the tariff issue, we have the representation issue, and now we have the issue on how do we count slaves. You know what, and one thing that we get a lot at this point is we should just end slavery. Why did the delegates get together and just say, hey, you know what, we're just going to end slavery? Well, I'll tell you what, that's a non-starter for those in the South for a couple of different reasons. They had their justifications, they had their rationalizations for holding on to slavery. One of those rationalizations for holding on to slavery was, and Mr. Fair talked about this, he talked about a philosopher named John Locke. And John Locke kind of talked about this whole concept of natural rights, you may remember. That's rights that were given to us not by a government but by God. And one of the things that John Locke said, one of these divine rights that people get from God, not from the government, is the right to keep and own property. And guess what the South considered those slaves? Well, in this instance, they consider them as property. I talked about how they considered them as population before, but now they're saying, no, they're property because, you can't take our property away from us. But, it's interesting, too, because as we get into this a little bit, as we get into the year help me out, Mr. Fair, 57, you said? Yeah. 1857, we're going to take a look at a Supreme Court ruling. And the Supreme Court ruling is going to use the Fifth Amendment, which talks about taking away somebody's property. So we're going to kind of hit this stuff later. The South would also use the argument that, of, hey, take a look at the Bible. Read the Bible. How many times does the Bible mention religion? I mean, come on. If it's in the Bible, it's got to be okay. So they use this religious argument all the time as well. Thirdly, and probably the most practical reason, and probably the real reason for it, was economics. I mean, the South is definitely economically tied to slaves. I mean, the slaves are their labor force at this time. The North is somewhat tied to it. It's going to get tied to it more and more later on. And we'll like I said, we'll take a look at that a little bit later. But, neither side, I don't know if either side, based on economics, would really want to end slavery at this time. But here's the thing. Really, both sides kind of said, let's just push this slavery, kind of like you guys doing homework. Hey, I'm going to put this homework off and maybe it'll just go away. That's what they said about slavery. They said, hey, let's just put this slavery thing off a little bit because it's going to go away. And they really firmly believe that. And from our point of view, we're like, that's ludicrous. Why would you believe that? I mean, we know that it doesn't go away until there's a whole war basically fought over this. But they didn't know that at the time. As a matter of fact, their kind of concept of this, their belief in this, seemed justified if you kind of know history a little bit. That's because, as they were working through the 1780s and the 1790s, slavery was kind of on a downfall. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of places that ended up ending slavery right around this time. So, remember, we're talking about the year 1787, right? Well, by 1793, Canada abolishes slavery. That's just like 6 years after the Constitutional Convention. By 1808, Great Britain bans slavery. 1811, Spain abolishes slavery. 1814, France bans slavery. So, that's not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, there was countries that very shortly after this time span, very shortly after 1787, ended up doing away with slavery. America really was the only, I guess, modern industrialized country that hung on to slavery. Anyway, so that's why we're not going to get rid of slavery. That's why the South said, no, we try to get rid of slavery, we're just going to walk away. You guys can have your own country. All right, so let's recap all of this. Okay, we're in the Constitutional Convention, remember, 1787. The South wants the states to determine that tariff issue that I talked about yesterday. The South wants equal representation at the federal level unless slaves are counted as population. Remember, the South wants the slaves to be counted as population, not property, as population. Okay? That's what the South wants. What does the North want? The North wants the federal government to determine tariffs. And they want proportional representation, but they want the slaves to be counted as property, to be taxed so their owners had to pay taxes on them. All right, so here are three distinctly different issues, but yet they're very much intertwined. And the solutions to these are going to be very much intertwined as well. All right, this is what we would call the era of compromise. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be honest with you, the era of compromise. This is, we're going to talk about compromises from here all the way to 1850. Matter of fact, there's a compromise of 1850. But we're going to see compromise after compromise after compromise from here on out. So, this first compromise, Mr. Ferry, do you want to talk about this first compromise? Let me take this. Cut you off guard over there.
All right. everybody. How you doing? There we go. So if you remember, the small states were supporting the New Jersey plan of the Constitutional Convention because they wanted equal representation, and they figured since we don't have a lot of people, we're going to have to be equal to like a state that has a lot of people. So they wanted one house based on equal representation. The larger states supported the Virginia plan because they thought, hey, if we got more people, we should have more power. And so they supported the Virginia plan, which was actually 2 houses, and both were proportional or based on population. All right? So that's the issue at hand. What is the resolution? Well, they came up with this compromise. They thought it was really good. They thought it was even better than good. They thought it was fantastic, but they decided they'd call it the Great Compromise. You know, what a creative word, the Great Compromise. Actually, sometimes it's you'll see it referred to as the Connecticut Compromise because the delegates from Connecticut kind of put it together, but we know it usually as the Great Compromise. So in a compromise, I think Mr. Ginther just said this, but both sides get something and both sides usually have to give up something. This one it's pretty straightforward. They decide that Congress will have 2 houses, so the Senate and the House of Representatives, or sometimes it's called the House of Representation, but House of Representatives. The Senate will be equal representation, so that was the Virginia plan part of it. So every state has 2 senators, doesn't matter how big your state is. You could be a small state like Rhode Island or a huge state like California, 2 senators. The House of Representatives is the other house, and that was from the Virginia plan, and that's based on population. So if you are California, you're going to have, like in today's day, you've got 53 representatives, I think it is, and Rhode Island probably has 2, maybe 3, I can't remember, 2, all right? So there you go. You've got a pretty straightforward compromise. However, actually, I think we're going to watch the video right now, and then we'll come back. So we're going to watch a real quick Hip Hughes video. He was the guy we watched the other day, and he'll maybe explain this a little bit in a more exciting fashion than Mr. Ginther or myself could.
Hey, you were the first one in, I think, on this?
Yeah.
You're the first one in on this? I think you're the one that creates the poll.
Yep. Okay.
I can't create a poll.
Okay. Hey guys, we're watching a video now. It's embedded in slide number 50. Number 50. So if you want to watch that and learn more about the Great Compromise, find it in slide 50. If you hear Mr. Ginther and I talking, that's because we're talking as the students are watching. Yeah, I did. I was going to say something I kept forgetting, and I wasn't sure if it was glitching or what. Can't do. Okay.
Looking at that video. All right, so we solved the problem of representation. Okay, that was one issue. But we still have a couple other lingering issues out there. We still have that tariff issue that we haven't settled. And here's the other thing: we can't really settle the representation issue altogether until we know about how the slaves are going to be counted. So remember, we got one side that wants slaves to be counted as property and the owner is taxed, and the other side that wants those slaves to be counted as population. So how can both sides get something out of this? Because remember, they're going to compromise. Well, this is a rather involved compromise. This is called the 3/5 compromise. And there's actually three different parts to this 3/5 compromise. Now, the first part's pretty straightforward. Part one just basically says, guess what? The federal government can control tariffs, and they can determine tariffs. So that's what the North wanted, right? So that's something for the North. So what does the South get out of this then? If the North has gotten that, what does the South get? Well, here's the thing. The South gets to count the slaves as population. Kind of. So here's the thing. The slaves, 3/5 of the slaves are going to be counted as population. However, not only are 3/5 of those slaves are going to be counted as population, but they're also going to be counted as property, and the owners, the Southerners, are going to be taxed. All right, so that's something the North gets. So the South gets to count them as population, but the North gets the taxes from them. All right. So that's what's going on there, Mr. Fair. All right, are we good? Yeah. All right. So that's kind of like the first and second part of the 3/5 compromise. First part being that the federal government determines taxes, and the second part saying that 3/5 of the slaves are going to be counted for the purposes of taxation and representation. So if you look at page 55, Mr. Fair, we got a nice little graphic of this, don't we?
But it shows you more of the great compromise, not the 3/5, but it gives you just a good visual representation of that compromise if you're a visual learner, which I am sort of on things like this. Look at graphics and stuff. So take a look at it. We just wanted to throw that in there. So let's keep going with the 3/5 compromise, though. Okay, so there's more to it, right? The Southerners essentially think, okay, well, at least we're counting 3 out of 5 slaves for population. We'll get some more power in the legislative branch, in the Congress, but they still thought the North was getting the better part of the deal. So they needed more, if you want to think about it like that. So they negotiated with the North that the issue of slavery, okay, and this is really, for the South, I mean, this was their biggest issue, because as Mr. Ginther said earlier, it was really about economics. So they were a little bit worried that maybe some of the Northerners would start to think, because slavery, a lot of other countries are trying to get rid of it, maybe the North is going to want to try to bring up a vote to end slavery, and they did not want that to happen. So they got this that you can see here written into the Constitution. It's in Article 1, Section 9. It says slavery, essentially, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, which effectively meant that if you were in the Congress, you couldn't bring up a bill, a proposed law to try to end slavery until at least the year 1808, or 20 years, basically 20 years out. Okay, and that kind of was to make everybody sort of happy and kind of put that off the table for a while. And like we've been saying, a lot of people thought, especially the Northerners probably, thought, this is probably going to be a good time. It's probably going to be naturally kind of ending anyway. it'll be a real easy vote to take, or an easier vote to take. Now we know that is the kind of the opposite of what happened, but that's part of it too. And you'll just notice slavery is in brackets there, and that's because the word slavery doesn't actually appear in that passage, or like I think there's only one other passage maybe. I guess it's probably the Fugitive Slave Clause, where they're referring to slavery, but they don't use the word slave or slaveries. In this case, I think it said such persons. They just didn't use it almost as if they didn't want to admit that there was slavery and put that into our document, our historical document. Okay, one more thing. South's not done yet. The other thing that they're worried about, and they will be continuously worried about this until the Civil War is over with, and that is the issue of slaves running away, slaves trying to escape to the North for freedom, okay? Even as far back as the time the Constitution was written. So they want a clause, a part of the Constitution that says any runaway slave caught in any other state, but we can assume we're talking about northern states, must be returned to their owners, back to wherever they were from. Because they were pretty skeptical that if they didn't put that in, no northerner was going to return them back to their respective owner. Okay? So it's the Fugitive Slave Clause. It doesn't actually get enforced very well, and there'll be more fugitive slave laws that are a little bit more stringent and have more teeth, and we'll talk about those as we get closer to the Civil War later in the year.
Guys are queued up the next video, Mr. Fair. You talked about how slavery is not used in the Constitution. So the Fugitive Slave Clause, it refers to persons held in service or labor. That's how it refers to slaves.
So it doesn't take much to figure out who they're referring to, right? Okay. Yeah, we're going to watch a real quick back to Hip Hughes. This one's much shorter, about 2 minutes on the 3/5 compromise. All right, you guys. See you later. We are basically done. Again, you can find the videos that you're missing embedded in your notes.